Case 1. Tiffany Moss, the Gwinnett County Starvation Horror. The suburbs of Gwinnett County, Georgia, represent the American dream for many families. Tree-lined streets, good schools, and a sense of community make it an ideal place to raise children. But in one home in Lawrenceville, a nightmare was unfolding that would shock the nation and result in one of the most severe punishments imaginable under Georgia law. Tiffany Moss seemed like an ordinary stepmother when she married Iman Moss in the mid-2000s. The couple lived together with Iman's children from a previous relationship, including a bright young girl named Imani Moss. What happened behind the walls of their suburban home would become one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse and murder in Georgia's modern history. Imani Moss was a beautiful child with her whole life ahead of her. She attended local schools, had friends, and by all outward appearances was a normal little girl navigating childhood. But something sinister was happening at home, something that teachers, neighbors, and even some family members failed to recognize until it was far too late. Tiffany Moss, Imani's stepmother, began a campaign of systematic abuse and starvation that would ultimately claim the child's life. The abuse was not sudden or impulsive. It was calculated, deliberate, and sustained over a prolonged period. Tiffany controlled every aspect of Imani's existence, determining when she could eat, where she could go, and how she would be treated within the household. The starvation was methodical and cruel. While other children in the home received adequate nutrition, Imani was systematically denied food. She was locked away, isolated from her siblings, and subjected to conditions that can only be described as torture. The little girl's body began to waste away as malnutrition took its devastating toll. Her weight plummeted to dangerous levels. Her organs began to fail. And through it all, Tiffany Moss watched without intervention, without mercy, without the basic human compassion that should exist between any adult and child, let alone a parental figure. Iman Moss, Imani's biological father, was complicit in this horror. He witnessed his daughter's deterioration and did nothing to stop it. He allowed Tiffany to continue the abuse without intervention. He failed in the most fundamental duty of parenthood, to protect his child from harm. His failure would come to haunt him in ways he could never have imagined. In November of 2013, the situation reached its tragic conclusion. 10-year-old Imani Moss died as a result of starvation and neglect. Her small body, ravaged by months of intentional deprivation, simply could not survive any longer. But Tiffany Moss's crimes did not end with Imani's death. What came next demonstrated a level of depravity that shocked even seasoned law enforcement officials. Rather than calling for help or admitting what had happened, Tiffany Moss took steps to conceal Imani's death in the most horrific way possible. She placed the child's body in a trash can. She then doused it with combustible liquid and set it on fire, attempting to destroy the evidence of her crimes. The image of a stepmother burning a child's remains in a residential trash can is one that defies comprehension, yet this is exactly what investigators determined happened. Neighbors eventually noticed smoke and called authorities. When Gwinnett County police arrived at the scene, they discovered the burned remains of a child. The investigation that followed would uncover the full scope of the horror that Imani had endured in the final months of her life. Medical examiners determined that Imani weighed shockingly little at the time of her death, far below what would be considered healthy for a child her age. Evidence of prolonged starvation was evident in every aspect of her remains. The autopsy painted a picture of systematic abuse that had gone on for months, possibly longer. Detectives interviewed family members, teachers, and neighbors. A pattern emerged of a child who had been increasingly isolated, who had missed school, who had appeared thin and withdrawn on the rare occasions when she was seen in public. Warning signs had been present, but the full extent of what was happening behind closed doors had remained hidden until it was too late. Tiffany Moss was arrested and charged with multiple counts including malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and concealing the death of another. Iman Moss was also arrested and faced similar charges for his role in Imani's death and the subsequent cover-up. The legal proceedings that followed were closely watched throughout Georgia and beyond. Iman Moss eventually accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a fitting punishment for a father who allowed his daughter to be tortured and killed. But Tiffany Moss made a different choice. She refused plea deals. She proceeded to trial. And in doing so, she put her fate in the hands of a Gwinnett County jury who would hear the full, horrific details of what she had done to an innocent child. The trial was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Prosecutors presented evidence of the systematic starvation, the isolation, the abuse, and finally the attempted destruction of Imani's body. Jurors saw photographs, heard testimony from medical examiners, and listened as investigators described what they found that November day in 2013. The defense had little to work with. There was no reasonable explanation for what Tiffany Moss had done. There was no justification for starving a child to death and then burning her remains. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury deliberated for a relatively short period before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Then came the penalty phase, where the jury would determine whether Tiffany Moss should receive life in prison or the death penalty. Georgia is a state that allows capital punishment in the most aggravated murder cases, and the prosecution argued that this case certainly qualified. They pointed to the vulnerability of the victim, the prolonged nature of the abuse, the depravity of the crime, and the attempted cover-up as aggravating factors that warranted the ultimate punishment. The jury agreed. In April of 2019, Tiffany Moss became one of the few women in Georgia sentenced to death. She would join death row at the Arendelle State Prison, where she awaits execution. The sentence sent a clear message. Georgia would not tolerate crimes against children, especially when committed by those who should have been protectors. Imani Moss's story is a tragedy that should never have happened. She was a child who deserved love, safety, and the opportunity to grow up. Instead, she suffered unimaginable cruelty at the hands of the very people who should have cared for her most. Her case led to calls for reform in how Child Protective Services monitors at-risk children and how schools identify and report suspected abuse. The Gwinnett County community was left to grapple with difficult questions. How could this have happened in their midst? Were there warning signs that were missed? Could Imani have been saved if someone had intervened earlier? These questions haunt everyone who followed the case. Teachers at Imani's school reported that there had been concerns about her attendance and appearance, but that the full extent of what was happening at home had not been apparent. Child Protective Services had reportedly been involved with the family at various points, but Imani had ultimately remained in the home where she would die. The systemic failures that allowed this tragedy to occur became subjects of intense scrutiny. Tiffany Moss remains on death row as of this recording, her appeals slowly working through the Georgia court system. Barring a successful appeal or commutation, she will eventually be executed for her crimes. Imani Moss will spend the remainder of his life in a Georgia prison, a living reminder that failing to protect a child can carry the same consequences as actively harming them. The case of Imani Moss serves as the first entry in our examination of Georgia's most evil mothers because it represents the betrayal of the most fundamental duty a parent has: to feed and protect their child. Tiffany Moss's crime was not a moment of passion or a tragic accident. It was a sustained campaign of cruelty that ended in death and desecration. It stands as one of the darkest chapters in Georgia's criminal history. If you're watching this and you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, please report it to authorities. One phone call could save a life. Imani Moss did not have someone who made that call in time, and the result was a tragedy that can never be undone. Case 2. Leilani Simon, the Chatham County disappearance and deception. The coastal city of Savannah, Georgia, is known for its historic charm, beautiful squares, and southern hospitality. But in October of 2022, Chatham County would become the center of a missing child case that would captivate the nation and ultimately reveal a mother's unspeakable crime. Leilani Simon was a young mother living in the Savannah area with her 20-month-old son, Quentin Simon. To the outside world, she appeared to be a typical young parent navigating the challenges of raising a toddler. But behind the facade of normalcy, something dark was brewing, something that would result in one of the most heartbreaking cases in recent Georgia history. On the morning of October 5, 2022, Leilani Simon called 911 to report that her son Quentin was missing. She told dispatchers that she had last seen the little boy in his playpen early that morning at their home outside Savannah. When she checked on him later, she claimed he was gone. The playpen was empty. The toddler had vanished. The response was immediate and massive. Chatham County Police, along with state and federal authorities, launched an extensive search for the missing toddler. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, searched nearby wooded areas, and followed up on every possible lead. Media outlets picked up the story, and soon images of little Quinton Simon were being shared across Georgia and beyond. The community rallied around the case. Volunteers joined search efforts. People shared posts on social media hoping someone had seen the little boy. Quinton became known affectionately as Chatham County's child, as residents invested themselves emotionally in finding him and bringing him home safely. But as investigators dug deeper into Leilani Simon's story, inconsistencies began to emerge. Her timeline did not add up. Details changed between tellings. Her behavior seemed off for a mother whose child was missing. Law enforcement officials began to suspect that this was not a simple case of a wandering toddler or a stranger abduction. They believed something far more sinister had occurred. Just 6 days after Quinton was reported missing, on October 11, 2022, Chatham County Police made a stunning announcement. Leilani Simon was the primary suspect in her son's disappearance and presumed death. They did not believe Quinton had wandered away. They did not believe a stranger had taken him. They believed his own mother was responsible for whatever had happened to him. The investigation intensified, focusing on Leilani and her activities in the days before and after Quinton's reported disappearance. Investigators executed search warrants, examined phone records, interviewed witnesses, and pieced together a timeline of events. What they discovered would lead them to one of the most difficult and disturbing search operations in Georgia law enforcement history. Evidence pointed investigators toward the Superior landfill in Chatham County. Based on what they had learned about Leilani's movements and activities, authorities believed that Quinton's body had been placed in a dumpster and subsequently transported to the landfill. The implications were horrifying. A mother had allegedly killed her own child and disposed of his body like garbage. Searching a landfill is one of the most challenging and dangerous tasks law enforcement can undertake. Landfills are massive, containing millions of pounds of waste. The working conditions are hazardous, with unstable ground, heavy machinery, and exposure to toxic materials. The FBI notes that historically, landfill searches are successful only about 5% of the time. The odds of finding Quinton's remains were extremely low, but Chatham County Police were determined to bring Quinton home. With assistance from the FBI and other agencies, they began the painstaking process of searching the landfill. Day after day, investigators and specialists sifted through mountains of trash. They worked in grueling and hazardous conditions, knowing that every shovel of waste they examined could potentially contain evidence or remains. The search continued for weeks. The community watched and waited, hoping for closure while dreading what that closure would mean. And then, on November 18, 2022, more than a month after Quinton was first reported missing, searchers made the discovery everyone had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Human remains were found in the landfill. The remains were carefully recovered and transported to the FBI Laboratory Division for analysis. DNA testing would be required to confirm what investigators already suspected, that these were the remains of 20-month-old Quinton Simon. The wait for confirmation was agonizing, but eventually the results came back positive. The bones found in that massive landfill did indeed belong to little Quinton. 3 days after Quinton's remains were discovered, on November 21, 2022, Leilani Simon was arrested. She was charged with an extensive list of offenses that reflected the severity of her alleged crimes. Malice murder, 2 counts of felony murder, concealing the death of another, making a false report of a crime, and 14 counts of making a false statement. The indictment told the story of a mother who had allegedly killed her own toddler, disposed of his body in a way that demonstrated complete disregard for his humanity, and then orchestrated an elaborate deception to cover up her crime. She had reported him missing knowing he was already dead. She had participated in search efforts while concealing what she had done. She had allowed the community to expend tremendous resources looking for a child she knew would not be found alive. The case proceeded through the legal system, and Leilani Simon exercised her right to trial. The proceedings would force everyone involved to relive the tragedy and confront the evidence of what had happened to Quinton. For 2 years, the case worked its way through Chatham County Superior Court as prosecutors prepared to present their case and the defense prepared to challenge it. Finally, in October of 2024, Almost exactly 2 years after Quentin was first reported missing, the case went to trial. Prosecutors presented their evidence over 8 days of testimony. Witnesses described Leilani's behavior before and after Quentin's disappearance. Investigators detailed how they had pieced together what happened. The FBI's role in the landfill search was described, including the extraordinary efforts made to find Quentin's remains. The defense argued that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and rumor, that there was insufficient evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Leilani had murdered her son. They requested directed verdicts of acquittal on the murder charges and concealing death charge, arguing the evidence was simply not there. The judge denied the request. The jury began deliberations on a Thursday afternoon around 3 o'clock. They deliberated for approximately 2 hours before breaking for the evening. The following Friday morning, at 9:30, they resumed their deliberations. The courthouse was tense as everyone waited to see what the jury would decide. At approximately 2:30 on Friday afternoon, October 25, 2024, the jury announced they had reached a verdict. After about 6.5 total hours of deliberation, they had examined all the evidence and come to their conclusion. One by one, the verdicts were read. Guilty of malice murder. Guilty of felony murder. Guilty of concealing the death of another. Guilty of making false statements. Leilani Simon was convicted on all 19 counts she faced. Throughout the trial, she had rarely shown emotion, but as the verdicts were read and her fate was sealed, she was seen crying before being taken away. The convictions brought a measure of justice for Quentin and provided some closure to the Chatham County community that had embraced him as their own. Chatham County Police Chief Jeff Hadley expressed gratitude for the verdict and reflected on what the case had meant to his department and the community. Quentin Simon truly became Chatham County's child during the weeks that our community was gripped by his disappearance, Chief Hadley said. It is fitting that today, 12 men and women from our county delivered the final measure of justice for little Quentin with their guilty verdict. We hope this brings some measure of peace and comfort to everyone who loved Quentin. District Attorney Shalina Cook-Jones and her team, including Assistant District Attorneys Tim Dean and Jenny Parker, were credited with their diligent prosecution of the case. The conviction represented a 2-year quest for justice that had required extraordinary dedication and resources. Leilani Simon's sentencing would come at a later date, where she would face the consequences of her actions. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole and is currently serving that sentence at Pulaski State Prison. As of January 2026, Simon is seeking a new trial, with a hearing scheduled in Chatham County Superior Court. The case of Quentin Simon is particularly heartbreaking because of his age and vulnerability. At 20 months old, he was completely dependent on his mother for care and protection. Instead of receiving that care, he allegedly suffered at her hands and was discarded as if he were worthless. The landfill search that ultimately recovered his remains stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officials who refused to give up on bringing Quentin home. This case also highlights the challenges of investigating crimes against children when the perpetrator is a parent. Parents have intimate access to children and control over their environments. When a parent decides to harm a child, they often have ample opportunity to do so without witnesses. And when that same parent reports the child missing, investigators must work through layers of deception to uncover the truth. The community impact of Quentin's case cannot be overstated. For weeks, Savannah area residents lived with the hope that the little boy might be found alive. The revelation that his own mother was suspected in his death was shocking. The confirmation that his remains had been found in a landfill was devastating. But the eventual conviction of Leilani Simon provided a sense that justice, while it could not bring Quentin back, had at least been served. As we move through this examination of Georgia's most evil mothers, Quentin Simon's case reminds us that evil can hide behind the most trusted facade of all, that of a loving parent. Leilani Simon's alleged actions represent a betrayal of the parent-child bond that is almost incomprehensible. Yet the jury heard the evidence and concluded that she was guilty of taking her own son's life and then lying about it repeatedly. Case 3. Christy Seipel, the Columbus trafficking nightmare. Columbus, Georgia, sits along the Chattahoochee River on the western border of the state, adjacent to Alabama. It is home to Fort Moore, one of the Army's largest installations, and has a rich history dating back to the early 19th century. But in the 2010s, Columbus would become the setting for one of the most disturbing cases of maternal depravity in Georgia history. Christy Seipel was not just accused of failing to protect her children. She was accused of actively participating in their exploitation in the most horrific way imaginable. The charges against her would include human trafficking, specifically sex trafficking of her own minor children. The case would expose a nightmare of abuse, exploitation, and betrayal that shocked the Muskogee County community. The details of Christy Seipel's crimes are difficult to discuss, even in a documentary format, because they involve the sexual exploitation of children. What we can say is that prosecutors alleged Seipel knowingly allowed and facilitated the abuse of her children by adults for financial gain and other considerations. She allegedly trafficked her own offspring, treating them not as human beings deserving of protection, but as commodities to be exploited. Human trafficking is often thought of as something involving strangers, criminals who kidnap or coerce victims they do not know. But the reality is that many trafficking victims, especially child victims, are trafficked by people they know and trust. In some of the most heartbreaking cases, parents or other family members are the traffickers. These are cases where the people who should be the first line of defense against exploitation become the exploiters themselves. In Christy Seipel's case, law enforcement became aware of the situation through investigative work and possibly reports from concerned individuals who had information about what was happening. The investigation that followed would uncover the extent of the abuse and build a case against Seipel and potentially others involved in the exploitation. The investigation into child sex trafficking cases is extraordinarily complex and sensitive. Investigators must gather evidence while also working to protect the child victims and provide them with appropriate services. They must interview traumatized children in ways that are both effective for building a legal case and minimally harmful to the victims. They must coordinate between multiple agencies, including law enforcement, child protective services, and victim advocacy organizations. In the Columbus case, investigators worked to document the abuse, identify all perpetrators and facilitators, and gather evidence sufficient to bring criminal charges. The evidence they compiled painted a picture of systematic exploitation orchestrated by a mother who should have been her children's greatest protector. Christy Seipel was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to human trafficking and child exploitation. The charges carried severe potential penalties, reflecting Georgia's strong stance against human trafficking and especially against the trafficking of children. Georgia law provides for lengthy prison sentences and other consequences for those convicted of human trafficking offenses. The legal proceedings in Seipel's case moved through the Muskogee County court system. The case presented challenges common to trafficking prosecutions, the need to protect child victim privacy, while also presenting sufficient evidence to secure a conviction, the trauma experienced by victims who might need to testify, and the complexity of proving the elements of trafficking charges. Prosecutors presented evidence of Seipel's role in facilitating the abuse of her children. They demonstrated that she had knowingly allowed the exploitation to occur, that she had participated in arranging for the abuse, and that she had benefited from it in various ways. The prosecution's case built a compelling argument that Christy Seipel had fundamentally betrayed her role as a mother. The defense, as is required in our legal system, challenged the prosecution's evidence and arguments. Defense attorneys may have questioned the credibility of witnesses, challenged the interpretation of evidence, or argued that Seipel's actions did not meet the legal definition of trafficking. But ultimately, the evidence presented convinced a jury of Seipel's guilt. Christy Seipel was convicted on trafficking charges related to her children. The conviction marked her as one of the most reviled types of criminals, a mother who had sold her own children's innocence and safety for personal gain. She was sentenced to a substantial prison term that will keep her incarcerated for many years, if not the rest of her life. The impact of Seipel's crimes on her children cannot be overstated. Child victims of sex trafficking experience profound trauma that can affect every aspect of their lives. They often struggle with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. The betrayal by a parent compounds this trauma in ways that are difficult to fully comprehend. Recovery from trafficking is a long and difficult process. The victims in this case would require extensive therapeutic services, a safe and stable living environment, and ongoing support to help them heal from what they experienced. The criminal justice system's role ends with the conviction and sentencing of the perpetrator, but the victim's journey toward healing extends far beyond that point. The Columbus community was shocked by the revelations of what Christy Seipel had done. Human trafficking is often thought of as something that happens elsewhere, in other countries, in big cities, to people we do not know. Cases like Seipel's remind us that trafficking can happen anywhere, can be perpetrated by anyone, and can victimize even those who should be safest in their own homes with their own families. This case also highlights the importance of community awareness and vigilance regarding child exploitation. Warning signs of trafficking can include children whose movements seem controlled by an adult, children who are isolated from peers and normal activities, children who show signs of physical or sexual abuse, and children who seem fearful or anxious around certain adults. While not every concerning situation involves trafficking, being alert to warning signs and reporting concerns to authorities can help protect vulnerable children. Christy Seipel's conviction sends a clear message that Georgia will prosecute those who traffic children, even when, or perhaps especially when, the trafficker is a parent. The case represents a complete perversion of the maternal role and stands as one of the most disturbing entries in our examination of Georgia's most evil mothers. As we continue our journey through these horrific cases, remember that behind each case are real children who suffered real trauma. These are not just stories or statistics. They are human tragedies that have lasting impacts on victims, families, and communities. If you suspect a child is being abused or exploited in any way, please contact law enforcement or call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Case 4. Rebecca Kipp, the Bibb County frustration killing. In the heart of central Georgia, Macon serves as the county seat of Bibb County. The city has a rich musical heritage and a diverse population, but it has also seen its share of tragedy. The case of Rebecca Kipp, known legally as Deanna Kipp, represents a particularly disturbing example of what can happen when frustration, anger, and a lack of proper parenting skills result in deadly violence against children. Rebecca Kipp was the mother of multiple children, including 4 young kids who depended on her for their care and protection. By all accounts, Kipp struggled with the demands of parenting. Multiple young children can be challenging under the best of circumstances, requiring patience, energy, and resources that not all parents possess in adequate supply. But most parents, even when overwhelmed, find ways to cope that do not involve harming their children. Rebecca Kipp made a different choice. According to the evidence presented at trial, Kipp's frustration with her children, particularly with their crying, demands for attention, and normal childhood behaviors, led her to take actions that would result in tragedy. The specific circumstances varied, but the pattern was clear. When Kipp became frustrated with her children, she responded with violence. The case came to the attention of authorities when one of Kipp's children suffered fatal injuries. The circumstances suggested that this was not an accident, but rather the result of intentional actions or extreme neglect. An investigation was launched, and what detectives uncovered was deeply disturbing. Evidence suggested that Kipp had subjected her children to ongoing abuse and neglect. The home environment was chaotic and unsafe. The children showed signs of physical abuse and inadequate care. And most tragically, Kipp's actions had directly led to the death of one child and serious harm to others. Medical examiners conducted an autopsy on the deceased child and determined the cause of death was consistent with inflicted injuries rather than accident or natural causes. The pattern of injuries told a story of abuse, multiple injuries of different ages, injuries in unusual locations, and injuries that could not be explained by normal childhood accidents. Child Protective Services had reportedly been involved with the Kipp family prior to the fatal incident. There had been concerns about the children's welfare, reports of possible neglect or abuse, and interventions aimed at improving the family situation. But as sometimes tragically happens, those interventions proved insufficient to prevent the ultimate tragedy. Rebecca Kipp was arrested and charged with multiple serious offenses, including felony murder, involuntary manslaughter, and cruelty to children. The charges reflected the severity of her alleged actions and the harm done to multiple children in her care. Prosecutors prepared to take the case to trial, determined to hold Kipp accountable for her crimes. The legal proceedings in Bibb County Superior Court would force everyone involved to confront the details of what had happened in the Kipp household. Prosecutors presented evidence of the abuse, the circumstances leading to the child's death, and Kipp's pattern of behavior toward her children. They argued that her actions went beyond simple loss of temper or poor judgment. They constituted criminal acts that warranted serious punishment. The defense faced an uphill battle. The evidence of abuse was substantial. The child's death was undeniable. The prosecution's case was strong. Defense attorneys may have attempted to present mitigating factors, perhaps arguing that Kipp was overwhelmed, that she suffered from mental health issues, or that she did not intend to cause death. But ultimately, these arguments proved insufficient to overcome the weight of evidence against her. The jury in Rebecca Kipp's case heard testimony from medical experts who explained the child's injuries and cause of death. They heard from investigators who described the conditions in the Kipp home and the evidence of ongoing abuse. They heard about the other children in the household and the abuse they had suffered, and they were asked to determine whether Rebecca Kipp was guilty of the crimes charged. After deliberating on the evidence, the jury returned with guilty verdicts. Rebecca Kipp was convicted of 4 counts of felony murder, 1 count of involuntary manslaughter, and 2 counts of cruelty to children in the first degree. She was also convicted of concealing the death of another, reflecting her attempts to hide or minimize what had happened. The convictions meant that Rebecca Kipp would face substantial prison time. Georgia law provides for severe sentences in cases involving the death of children, especially when that death results from intentional acts or extreme neglect by a caregiver. The judge in the case had discretion in sentencing within the parameters provided by law, but the convictions virtually guaranteed that Kipp would spend many years, if not the rest of her life, in prison. At sentencing, the judge considered the nature of the crimes, the harm done to the victims, and any mitigating or aggravating factors. The decision reflected the seriousness with which Georgia courts treat crimes against children. Rebecca Kipp received a sentence that would keep her incarcerated for the foreseeable future, ensuring she would no longer pose a threat to children. The case prompted reflection on how society supports struggling parents and protects vulnerable children. Parenting is difficult, and many parents experience frustration, stress, and feelings of being overwhelmed. But the vast majority of parents find appropriate ways to cope with these feelings. They reach out for help, they take breaks, they use appropriate discipline techniques. They do not respond to normal childhood behavior with deadly violence. Rebecca Kipp's case also raised questions about the Child Protective Services system. Had there been warning signs that were missed? Were interventions adequate? Could more have been done to protect these children before tragedy struck? These are difficult questions without easy answers, but they are important to ask as we work to prevent similar tragedies in the future. For the surviving children in the Kipp household, the trauma of what they experienced will likely affect them for the rest of their lives. They witnessed and experienced abuse. They lost a sibling. They saw their mother arrested and convicted. They now must navigate childhood and adolescence with the weight of these experiences affecting their development and well-being. The Bibb County community, like communities across Georgia in each of these cases, was forced to confront the reality that child abuse can happen anywhere, can be committed by anyone, and often occurs behind closed doors where it is difficult for outsiders to detect. The case serves as a reminder of the importance of being alert to signs of child abuse and reporting concerns to appropriate authorities. Rebecca Kipp's conviction in 2013 added another entry to the tragic list of mothers who have harmed their own children in Georgia. Her case represents what prosecutors might call a frustration killing, a death that results not from premeditation or careful planning, but from a parent's inability to cope with the normal stresses of child rearing and a willingness to use violence as a response to that frustration. The case stands as a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences that can result when parents lack adequate coping skills, support systems, and impulse control. It demonstrates that being frustrated with children, while understandable, is never an excuse for violence. And it serves as yet another example of the betrayal that occurs when a mother, who should be a source of safety and comfort, becomes instead a source of fear and harm. Case 5. Jennifer Lee Cooper, the Chatham County methamphetamine tragedy. Returning to Chatham County, where we earlier examined the case of Leilani Simon, we encounter another maternal tragedy with very different circumstances, but an equally devastating outcome. Jennifer Lee Cooper's case demonstrates how substance abuse can intersect with parental responsibility in ways that prove fatal for innocent children. Methamphetamine addiction is a scourge affecting communities across Georgia and throughout the United States. The drug is highly addictive, profoundly damaging to users' physical and mental health, and often associated with criminal activity, neglect, and violence. When adults with parental responsibilities become addicted to methamphetamine, the consequences for their children can be catastrophic. Jennifer Lee Cooper was a mother struggling with methamphetamine addiction. The drug had taken over her life, affecting her judgment, her priorities, and her ability to function as a responsible parent. While addiction is a disease that warrants compassion and treatment, it does not absolve individuals of responsibility for their actions, especially when those actions harm vulnerable children. The specifics of Cooper's case involve circumstances where her methamphetamine use directly contributed to the death of her child. The exact mechanism varied. It could have involved direct exposure of the child to drugs, neglect of the child's basic needs while Cooper was using or seeking drugs, or violence committed while Cooper was under the influence. Regardless of the specific circumstances, the fundamental fact remained. Jennifer Cooper's drug use led to her child's death. Methamphetamine can affect users in numerous ways that create dangers for children in their care. Users may experience paranoia, hallucinations, and violent outbursts. They may neglect children's basic needs for food, medical care, and supervision. They may expose children to dangerous environments, including drug manufacturing sites where toxic chemicals are present. They may allow other drug users into the home, creating additional risks. And in some tragic cases, they may harm children directly while under the influence or during the irritability and depression that often accompany withdrawal. In Cooper's case, law enforcement and child protective services became involved after her child suffered fatal harm. The investigation that followed would document Cooper's drug use, the circumstances of the child's death, and the evidence linking Cooper's actions or inactions to that tragic outcome. Investigators in cases involving drug-using parents face particular challenges. The environments they encounter are often chaotic, with evidence of drug use throughout the home. Other children may be present and in need of immediate protection. The parent may be under the influence during initial contact, making communication difficult. And there may be other adults present who are also using drugs and potentially involved in the child's death. In the Cooper case, authorities gathered evidence of her methamphetamine use and established a timeline of events leading to the child's death. They documented the conditions in the home, interviewed witnesses, and built a case demonstrating that Cooper's drug use and the resulting neglect or direct harm had caused her child's death. Jennifer Cooper was arrested and charged with serious offenses related to her child's death. The charges likely included murder or manslaughter, child cruelty, and possibly drug-related offenses. Prosecutors in Chatham County prepared to hold Cooper accountable for the fatal consequences of her addiction. The legal proceedings would address not only what Cooper had done, but also the question of her culpability, given her addiction. Defense attorneys might argue that addiction impaired Cooper's judgment, that she did not intend to harm her child, or that the death was a tragic accident rather than a crime. Prosecutors, however, would argue that regardless of addiction, Cooper had a responsibility to her child that she had fatally breached. The case proceeded through the Chatham County court system. Evidence of Cooper's drug use was presented, along with evidence of how that drug use had led to the child's death. Medical testimony explained the child's injuries or condition at the time of death. Investigators described what they had found in the Cooper home and how they had pieced together what happened. The jury was tasked with determining whether Jennifer Cooper's actions, even if influenced by addiction, constituted criminal conduct warranting conviction and punishment. They would have to balance compassion for someone suffering from addiction against the need to hold her accountable for the death of an innocent child who depended on her for protection. The verdict, when it came, found Jennifer Cooper guilty of charges related to her child's death. The conviction acknowledged that while addiction is a disease, it does not excuse the fatal consequences when a parent's drug use leads to a child's death. Cooper was sentenced to a substantial prison term that reflected the seriousness of her crimes. The case highlights the intersection of substance abuse and child welfare, an intersection that too often results in tragedy. Children living with parents who abuse drugs face elevated risks of neglect, abuse, and fatal harm. They may be exposed to toxic chemicals in homes where drugs are manufactured. They may be left unsupervised while parents use drugs or seek them out. They may lack adequate food, medical care, and safe living conditions. And in the worst cases, they may suffer direct harm from parents whose judgment and impulse control are impaired by drugs. Georgia, like many states, has struggled with how to address the overlap between drug addiction and child endangerment. The child welfare system tries to work with families to address substance abuse issues and keep children safely with their parents when possible. But when children are seriously harmed or killed as a result of parental drug use, the criminal justice system must step in to provide accountability and justice. Jennifer Cooper's case also raises questions about what could have been done differently. Were there interventions available that might have helped Cooper address her addiction before tragedy struck? Was the child welfare system involved with the family prior to the death? Were there warning signs that were missed or not adequately addressed? These questions are important for prevention, even though in Cooper's case they come too late to save her child. For communities affected by the methamphetamine epidemic, cases like Cooper's serve as stark reminders of the drug's devastating impact not just on users, but on innocent children in their care. They underscore the importance of accessible addiction treatment, early intervention by child protective services, and community awareness of the warning signs that a child may be at risk. The surviving family members of Cooper's child, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, must now cope with the loss and with the knowledge that the death was preventable. They must grapple with complex emotions including grief, anger, and perhaps guilt about whether they could have done more to protect the child or help Cooper overcome her addiction. Jennifer Lee Cooper's conviction adds another chapter to the tragic story of mothers whose actions have resulted in their children's deaths in Georgia. Her case is distinct from some others in this documentary in that drugs played a central role, but the fundamental betrayal is the same. A mother who should have protected her child instead became the cause of that child's death. As we continue examining these cases, it is worth remembering that substance abuse is a treatable condition. Many people struggling with addiction do seek help, do recover, and do become healthy parents. But for Jennifer Cooper and her child, treatment and recovery came too late. The case stands as a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of untreated addiction combined with parental responsibility. Case 6. April Evelyn Short, the Fort Eisenhower federal case. Fort Eisenhower, formerly known as Fort Gordon, is a United States Army installation located near Augusta, Georgia. As a military base, it falls under federal jurisdiction, which means that serious crimes committed on the installation are prosecuted in federal court rather than state court. This jurisdictional distinction is important in understanding the case of April Evelyn Short, whose crimes against her children led to federal charges and a federal prosecution. April Short was connected to the Fort Eisenhower community, living on or near the installation with her children. The military community is often seen as one that supports families and provides resources to help military members and their dependents thrive. But even within this structured environment, child abuse can occur, hidden behind closed doors and masked by an appearance of normalcy. The details of April Short's crimes involve serious abuse and neglect of her children. The abuse was severe enough that when it came to the attention of authorities, federal prosecutors determined that charges should be brought under federal law. Federal child abuse statutes provide for prosecution when crimes occur on federal property or involve federal interests, and they carry serious potential penalties. Federal investigations into child abuse cases are typically thorough and resource-intensive. Agencies like the Federal Bureau of Investigation may be involved, along with military law enforcement, child protective services, and other specialized investigators. The goal is to document the abuse, protect the child victims, and build a case strong enough to secure convictions. In April Short's case, investigators uncovered evidence of systematic abuse of her children. The nature of this abuse was serious enough to warrant federal criminal charges rather than simply referral to state authorities or military administrative processes. This suggests that the abuse was severe, well documented, and fell clearly within federal jurisdiction. April Short was indicted by a federal grand jury on charges related to child abuse. Federal grand juries hear evidence presented by prosecutors and determine whether there is probable cause to believe crimes have been committed. The return of an indictment against Short indicated that the grand jury found sufficient evidence of her crimes to warrant prosecution. The case proceeded through the federal court system, which operates somewhat differently from state courts. Federal prosecutors are United States attorneys who represent the federal government. Defense attorneys may be privately retained or may be federal public defenders. The judges are federal district court judges appointed for life terms. And the rules of procedure and evidence follow federal rather than state law. Federal trials are often more formal and procedurally complex than state trials. The resources available to federal prosecutors are typically substantial, allowing for thorough investigation and expert testimony. At the same time, federal defendants have the same constitutional rights as state defendants, including the right to a jury trial, the right to confront witnesses, and the right to present a defense. In Short's case, prosecutors presented evidence of the abuse her children had suffered. This may have included medical evidence of injuries, testimony from the children themselves, statements from witnesses who had observed the abuse or its effects, and physical evidence from the home where the abuse occurred. The prosecution's case painted a picture of a mother who had systematically harmed her own children. The defense in a federal child abuse case faces significant challenges. The evidence is often overwhelming, particularly when there are multiple child victims, medical documentation of injuries, and testimony from credible witnesses. Defense strategies might include challenging the admissibility of evidence, questioning the credibility of witnesses, or arguing that the abuse was less severe than alleged. But in cases with strong evidence, these strategies often prove insufficient. April Short was convicted in federal court of charges related to child abuse. The conviction came after presentation of evidence and deliberation by a jury or possibly through a guilty plea, depending on how the case was resolved. Federal convictions for child abuse carry serious sentences, and Short faced substantial prison time as a result. Federal sentencing guidelines provide a framework for determining appropriate sentences based on the nature of the offense, the defendant's criminal history, and various aggravating or mitigating factors. In child abuse cases, aggravating factors often include the age and vulnerability of the victims, the severity of the abuse, the duration of the abuse, and any efforts to conceal it. These factors can result in significantly enhanced sentences. April Short was sentenced to a term of imprisonment in federal prison. Federal prisoners serve their time in Bureau of Prisons facilities located throughout the United States. Unlike many state systems, federal law provides for relatively limited early release opportunities, meaning that inmates typically serve a substantial portion of their sentences. The impact of Short's crimes on her children cannot be overstated. Children who suffer abuse at the hands of their parents experience profound trauma that affects their physical health, mental health, emotional development, and ability to form trusting relationships. The abuse by a mother, who should be a child's primary source of comfort and security, creates particularly deep psychological wounds. Recovery from this type of abuse requires extensive therapeutic intervention, stable and nurturing alternative living arrangements, and often ongoing support into adulthood. The children in Short's case would need to be placed in safe homes, provided with trauma-informed therapy, and given the opportunity to heal in an environment free from abuse. The military community context of this case adds additional dimensions worth considering. Military families face unique stresses including frequent relocations, deployments, and the pressures of military life. While the vast majority of military families successfully navigate these challenges, some families struggle, and children can be at risk when parents lack adequate support or coping mechanisms. The military has extensive family support programs designed to help families cope with military life and to identify and address problems early. But as this case demonstrates, these programs are not always sufficient to prevent abuse. When abuse does occur in military-connected families, the federal jurisdiction means that prosecution happens in federal court, often resulting in more serious consequences than might occur in some state prosecutions. April Short's case represents a betrayal not only of her children, but also of the trust placed in parents within the military community. Military families are supposed to support each other, and the abuse of children violates the values of service and integrity that the military seeks to instill. Her conviction sent a message that child abuse will not be tolerated even within the military community, and that those who harm children will face serious federal consequences. For the broader Fort Eisenhower community, the case served as a reminder that vigilance is always necessary when it comes to protecting children. Even in structured environments with support systems in place, abuse can occur. Community members, neighbors, teachers, coaches, other parents play an important role in identifying potential abuse and reporting concerns to appropriate authorities. Federal prosecution of child abuse cases like April Short's demonstrates the seriousness with which the federal government treats crimes against children. The resources devoted to these prosecutions, the severe penalties upon conviction, and the public nature of the proceedings all underscore that protecting children is a paramount priority. As we continue our examination of Georgia's most evil mothers, April Short's case stands out for its federal jurisdiction and military connection. But the fundamental crime is the same as in the other cases we have examined. A mother who should have protected her children instead became their abuser. Her conviction and imprisonment represent justice for her child victims and serve as a warning to anyone who might contemplate harming children. Case 7. Jennifer Rosenbaum, the Henry County foster care tragedy. Henry County, located in the Atlanta metropolitan area, is a rapidly growing community known for its suburban neighborhoods and family-friendly atmosphere. Many families in Henry County open their homes to foster children, providing care for kids who have been removed from dangerous situations. The foster care system is built on the premise that substitute caregivers will provide safety, stability, and nurturing to vulnerable children. But the case of Jennifer Rosenbaum represents a horrific betrayal of that trust. Jennifer Rosenbaum was a foster parent in Henry County who was entrusted with the care of children removed from their biological families. These children had already experienced trauma. The trauma of whatever circumstances led to their removal, the trauma of being separated from their families, and the trauma of entering an unfamiliar home with unfamiliar caregivers. They were among the most vulnerable children in Georgia, desperately needing adults who would provide the care and protection they had not received in their original homes. Instead of providing that care, Jennifer Rosenbaum subjected her foster children to abuse that would ultimately result in tragedy. The details of her crimes reveal a pattern of mistreatment, neglect, and violence directed at children who were powerless to protect themselves and who had nowhere else to turn for safety. Foster care abuse cases are particularly disturbing because they involve a double betrayal. The first betrayal occurred in the child's original home, necessitating placement in foster care. The second betrayal occurs when the foster parent, specifically recruited and supposedly vetted to provide safe care, instead becomes another source of harm. For children experiencing this double betrayal, the message is devastating. No adult can be trusted, no home is safe. The case came to light when one of Rosenbaum's foster children suffered fatal harm. The circumstances of the death triggered an immediate response from law enforcement and child protective services. Investigators had to determine not only what had caused this particular child's death, but also whether other children in the home were at risk and whether there was a pattern of abuse. What investigators uncovered was deeply troubling. Evidence suggested that Rosenbaum had been abusing her foster children over a period of time. The fatal incident was not an isolated event, but rather the culmination of ongoing mistreatment. Other children in the home showed signs of abuse or neglect. The environment that was supposed to be therapeutic and nurturing was instead harmful and dangerous. Medical examiners conducted an autopsy on the deceased child and determined that the death resulted from inflicted injuries consistent with child abuse. The pattern and severity of injuries indicated that this was not an accident, but rather intentional harm or extreme neglect. Additional investigation of the other children in the home revealed evidence of abuse affecting multiple victims. Jennifer Rosenbaum was arrested and charged with murder and other serious offenses related to the death of her foster child and the abuse of others in her care. The charges reflected the gravity of her alleged crimes and the special responsibility she had undertaken as a foster parent. The foster care system failure represented by this case prompted immediate review of how foster parents are screened, monitored, and supervised in Henry County and throughout Georgia. While the vast majority of foster parents are dedicated individuals who provide loving homes to vulnerable children, Cases like Rosenbaum's highlight the critical importance of thorough screening and ongoing oversight. Foster parent licensing in Georgia involves background checks, home studies, training requirements, and regular monitoring by caseworkers. But as this case demonstrates, even with these safeguards in place, some individuals who should never be entrusted with vulnerable children slip through the system. The question becomes how to improve screening and oversight without discouraging good people from becoming foster parents or making the system so intrusive that it becomes unworkable. The prosecution of Jennifer Rosenbaum proceeded through Henry County Superior Court. Prosecutors presented evidence of the abuse, the circumstances of the child's death, and Rosenbaum's responsibility for what had occurred. They argued that she had violated the most fundamental duty of a foster parent and had caused the death of a child who had been placed in her care for protection. The defense faced the challenge of trying to explain or mitigate circumstances that appeared indefensible. How does one defend a foster parent accused of killing a foster child? The strategies available are limited, perhaps arguing that the death was accidental, that Rosenbaum lacked intent to harm, or that mitigating circumstances should be considered in sentencing. But with strong evidence of abuse and a dead child, such arguments face skepticism. The jury in Rosenbaum's case heard testimony from medical experts, investigators, surviving foster children, and others with knowledge of what had occurred in the Rosenbaum home. They saw evidence of the abuse and heard descriptions of the fatal injuries suffered by the victim, and they were asked to determine whether Jennifer Rosenbaum was guilty of the crimes charged. The verdict found Jennifer Rosenbaum guilty of charges including murder and child cruelty. The conviction meant that she would face severe punishment for her crimes. At sentencing, the judge considered the nature of the offenses, the special position of trust Rosenbaum had held as a foster parent, and the harm done to multiple vulnerable children. Jennifer Rosenbaum was sentenced to a lengthy prison term that will keep her incarcerated for many years. The sentence reflected the seriousness with which Georgia courts view crimes against children, especially when committed by foster parents who hold positions of special trust and responsibility. For the surviving children who had been in Rosenbaum's care, the aftermath of the case meant another disruption, another placement, and more trauma to process. They had already experienced removal from their biological families. They had then been placed with a foster parent who abused them. Now they would need to be placed again, this time hopefully with caregivers who would truly provide the safety and nurturing they needed. The psychological impact of foster care abuse on children is profound and long-lasting. These children already have attachment difficulties from their early experiences. Abuse in foster care reinforces their belief that adults cannot be trusted and that they are not safe anywhere. Helping them heal requires extraordinary patience, skill, and commitment from subsequent caregivers and therapists. The Henry County Division of Family and Children Services had to examine its role in the tragedy and determine whether there were failures in screening, placement, or oversight that had allowed Rosenbaum to become a foster parent and to continue caring for children even as abuse was occurring. Such reviews are painful but necessary to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The broader foster care community in Georgia and beyond was affected by this case. Foster parents who provide excellent care to vulnerable children sometimes face increased scrutiny or suspicion as a result of cases like Rosenbaum's. The public trust in the foster care system can be shaken when abuse occurs in foster homes. And the challenge of recruiting quality foster parents becomes even greater when potential applicants hear about cases like this. But it is important to remember that the vast majority of foster parents are good people doing difficult and important work. They open their homes and hearts to children in need, providing stability, love, and nurturing during difficult times. Cases like Jennifer Rosenbaum's are the exceptions, not the rule. The appropriate response is not to condemn foster care as a system, but rather to work continuously to improve screening, training, and oversight to minimize the risk of abuse. Jennifer Rosenbaum's conviction represents justice for her victim and accountability for her crimes. But it cannot undo the harm she caused or restore the life she took. The child who died in her care will never have the opportunity to grow up, to heal from early trauma, to form healthy relationships, or to experience the good life that foster care should have provided. The other children she abused will carry scars from their time in her home. As we approach the final cases in our examination of Georgia's most evil mothers, Jennifer Rosenbaum's case stands as a reminder that evil can infiltrate even systems designed to protect children. Foster care, social services, schools, churches, all these institutions depend on the good faith and integrity of the adults who work within them. When someone like Rosenbaum violates that trust, the consequences ripple far beyond the immediate victims. Case 8. Brittany Hall, the Gwinnett County Hotel Room Horror. We return to Gwinnett County, where we began our examination with the case of Tiffany Moss, for another horrific case of maternal evil. The story of Brittany Hall and her 8-year-old daughter Amari represents one of the most disturbing cases of child abuse and murder in recent Georgia history. The case shocked the state with its brutality and the calculated deception that followed Amari's death. In November of 2021, Brittany Hall was living with her girlfriend Celeste Owens and her 3 young children in a Homewood Suites hotel in Norcross, a city in Gwinnett County. Hotel living is often a sign of family instability, perhaps financial difficulties, housing insecurity, or other challenges that make traditional housing unavailable. For many families, hotel living is temporary and difficult, but parents do their best to provide care and normalcy for their children in challenging circumstances. But for Brittany Hall's children, life in that hotel room was a nightmare. Behind the closed door of their hotel suite, Brittany and Celeste subjected the children to systematic abuse that would ultimately claim 8-year-old Amari's life. On the morning of November 19, 2021, Brittany Hall and Celeste Owens contacted authorities to report that Amari was missing. They claimed that when they woke up around 10 in the morning, Amari was gone from the hotel room. They said they had last seen her the night before and could not explain her disappearance. The implication was clear. Someone had taken Amari or she had wandered away during the night. The response from Gwinnett County Police was immediate. A missing 8-year-old child is an emergency that triggers an all-out search effort. Officers canvassed the hotel and surrounding area. They interviewed witnesses. They reviewed security camera footage. They followed up on every possible lead. The community was alerted, and people across Gwinnett County kept watch for any sign of the missing girl. But as investigators dug deeper into Brittany and Celeste's story, they found inconsistencies and evidence that suggested something far more sinister than a missing child case. Hotel security footage would prove crucial to uncovering the truth. Investigators obtained footage from surveillance cameras inside and outside the hotel. What they discovered was horrifying. The footage showed Brittany Hall and Celeste Owens abusing all 3 of Hall's children inside the hotel room. The abuse was not mild or questionable. It was clear, brutal physical abuse captured on video. The children were being beaten and kicked by the 2 women who should have been caring for them. The surveillance footage contradicted Brittany and Celeste's story about Amari wandering away or being taken. If the children were being abused in the hotel room, as the footage clearly showed, then what had really happened to Amari? Investigators also examined Celeste Owens' cell phone, which provided additional crucial evidence. They discovered that Owens had deleted videos from a Nest camera that had been in the hotel room. These deleted videos showed more evidence of the abuse being inflicted on the children. But the phone contained other important information as well. In the phone's search history, investigators found disturbing queries that had been entered on the day Amari was reported missing. The searches included phrases like, "What to do when a child doesn't listen," "Lakes near me," "How do sewers on the streets work?" "Why do kids run away?" "How do I report someone missing?" and U-Haul, customer account. The progression of these searches painted a damning picture. Someone researching how to dispose of something, how to report someone missing, and how to rent a vehicle. The U-Haul search was particularly significant. Investigators followed up and discovered that Celeste Owens had indeed rented a U-Haul van. Additional surveillance footage showed Owens driving this U-Haul to DeKalb County, the neighboring county to the east of Gwinnett. This information gave investigators a crucial lead about where Amari might actually be. Based on this evidence, investigators focused their search on DeKalb County. They were no longer looking for a missing child who had wandered away. They were looking for a body that had been deliberately concealed. The search teams worked methodically through wooded areas in DeKalb County, following the route that Celeste had driven with the U-Haul. On November 23, 2021, just 4 days after Amari was reported missing, searchers made the dreaded discovery. In a wooded area of DeKalb County, they found Amari's body. The little girl had been placed in 3 white plastic trash bags, one over her head and upper body, one over her legs, and one wrapped around her torso and abdomen, tied with black rope. Some parts of her body were visible through gaps in the bags. She had lacerations on her arms. She had been discarded like garbage and left in the woods. The condition of Amari's body told investigators much about what had happened to her. She had not died from natural causes or an accident. She had been killed. The question was whether Brittany Hall, Celeste Owens, or both were responsible for her death. The autopsy conducted by the medical examiner provided crucial answers. Dr. Karen Sullivan, the Gwinnett County Associate Medical Examiner, determined that Amari died from blunt force trauma and battered child syndrome. At the time of her death, the 8-year-old weighed only 54 pounds, significantly underweight for a child her age. Her body showed evidence of multiple injuries, including a lacerated liver. The pattern of injuries indicated ongoing abuse culminating in fatal trauma. Armed with this evidence, investigators arrested both Brittany Hall and Celeste Owens. The charges were severe: malice murder, felony murder, child cruelty, concealing the death of another, making false statements, and additional counts related to the abuse of the other children. The 2 cases proceeded separately through the Gwinnett County legal system. Celeste Owens went to trial first, in December of 2024. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of her role in Amari's death and the abuse of all 3 children. They showed the surveillance footage of the abuse. They presented the disturbing search history from her phone. They demonstrated that she had rented the U-Haul used to transport Amari's body. Medical testimony established that Amari had died from injuries consistent with being beaten repeatedly. The trial was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Prosecutors described the abuse as barbaric. They told the jury that Celeste Owens had helped beat the living life out of Amari. The evidence was so disturbing that Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney Sabrina Nizam told reporters, "The images that we have seen we will never be able to unsee. We will never be able to unhear the things that we did during this trial, and it is by far the worst case involving a child I have ever seen." The defense faced an almost impossible task. The evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance footage was damning. The medical evidence was clear. Defense attorney Robert Greenwald argued that there was no direct evidence that Owens had killed Amari, but the prosecution countered that both women had participated in the systematic abuse that led to Amari's death. The jury deliberated for just under 2 hours before reaching their verdict. On December 13, 2024, they found Celeste Owens guilty on all 20 counts she faced. The convictions included malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, aggravated assault, and multiple counts of child cruelty. At sentencing, Judge Angela Duncan delivered a statement that captured the horror of what Celeste Owens had done. "This is by far the most heinous evil that I have ever seen in my entire career," Judge Duncan said. "It is something I will never understand, nor will I ever forget it." She sentenced Owens to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus a consecutive 235-year sentence. "You will never see the light of day to perpetrate this type of behavior, cruelty, and evilness upon another person," the judge told Owens. Following Celeste Owens's conviction, attention turned to Brittany Hall. As Amari's biological mother, her betrayal was even more profound. She had given birth to Amari, had been responsible for her care since infancy, and should have been her daughter's primary protector. Instead, prosecutors alleged, she had participated in the abuse and had helped cover up Amari's death. Brittany Hall was initially indicted on 17 counts similar to those Owens faced. But rather than proceeding to trial, Hall made the decision to accept a plea deal. In September of 2025, she pleaded guilty to felony murder, 11 counts of cruelty to children, concealing the death of another, and making false statements. At the plea hearing, prosecutors detailed the evidence against Hall. They explained that while Celeste Owens had been the one who primarily inflicted the fatal injuries on Amari, Brittany Hall had been present, had participated in some of the abuse, and had helped conceal what happened. She had allowed her girlfriend to abuse her children. She had failed to protect them. And when Amari died, she had participated in disposing of the body and reporting a false story to police. Judge sentenced Brittany Hall to life in prison. The sentence would allow for the possibility of parole, unlike Owens's sentence, but Hall would spend decades behind bars for her crimes. District Attorney Patsy Austin-Gatson issued a statement capturing the essence of Hall's betrayal. This mother failed to protect her children and joined in the abuse. This ended tragically. We continue to pray that her siblings can heal from the abuse they endured and that this plea brings closure to them and their extended family. The surviving children, Amari's two younger siblings, had witnessed and experienced the abuse in that hotel room. They had seen their sister killed and her body removed. They had been abused themselves. The trauma they experienced will affect them for the rest of their lives. Following the arrests, the children were removed from their mother's custody. Initially placed with the Division of Family and Children's Services, DFCS, they were eventually allowed to live with Brittany Hall's mother, their grandmother. As of the most recent reports, they are no longer in DFCS custody and are living with family members who can provide the care and healing environment they need. The case of Brittany Hall and Amari raised important questions about how the abuse could have continued as long as it did without intervention. According to reports, DFCS had been involved with the Hall family previously. There had been concerns about the children's welfare. But somehow Amari and her siblings remained in their mother's care, ultimately with fatal consequences. It is always easier in hindsight to see where interventions should have occurred. Child Protective Services workers face impossible caseloads, limited resources, and the difficult task of balancing family preservation with child safety. They must make judgment calls about which children are at imminent risk and which families can be helped without removing children. Sometimes those judgments are tragically wrong. The hotel living situation also raised questions. Hotels are not designed as long-term housing for families with children. When families live in hotels for extended periods, it often indicates significant instability, financial problems, housing insecurity, or other challenges. These are risk factors for child abuse and neglect. Yet hotels provide little opportunity for the kind of community oversight that might occur in traditional neighborhoods where neighbors, teachers, and others might notice warning signs. The surveillance footage that proved so crucial in this case was from the hotel's security systems. The Nest camera footage that was deleted from Owens's phone had been from a camera the couple had set up in the hotel room, perhaps to monitor the children, perhaps for other purposes. The irony is that the very surveillance technology that the perpetrators may have used to maintain control over the children ultimately provided the evidence to convict them. Amari's grandmother spoke to the media about the pain of losing her granddaughter. "My granddaughter did not deserve the way she was taken out of this world," she said. Her words captured the grief and outrage felt by everyone who learned about this case. No child deserves abuse. No child deserves to be beaten to death. And no child deserves to be wrapped in trash bags and dumped in the woods. The Gwinnett County community, which had rallied to search for Amari when she was first reported missing, was devastated to learn the truth about what had happened to her. The little girl with the bright smile who appeared in the missing person photos had not wandered away or been kidnapped by a stranger. She had been killed by the two women who should have loved and protected her most. Police Chief Chris Martin of the Gwinnett County Police Department acknowledged the difficulty of the case and praised the investigators who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth and seek justice for Amari. The conviction of both Brittany Hall and Celeste Owens represented successful prosecution of a horrific crime. But success in legal terms could not restore Amari's life or erase the trauma experienced by her siblings. As this case demonstrates, some of the most dangerous people to children are not strangers lurking in shadows, but rather the parents and parental figures who have intimate access to them. Children living with abusive parents often have no way to escape, no way to seek help, and no way to protect themselves. They depend entirely on the adults in their lives to choose not to harm them. When those adults make a different choice, as Brittany Hall and Celeste Owens did, the results can be fatal. Brittany Hall's case adds to the growing list of Georgia mothers who have betrayed the most fundamental duty of parenthood. Her guilty plea spared the community the trauma of another trial, but it did not spare her from accountability. She will spend the majority of her life in prison, a consequence of her decision to allow and participate in the abuse that killed her daughter. Case 9. Lamora Williams, the Atlanta Oven Horror. The city of Atlanta, Georgia's capital and largest city, is a vibrant metropolis with a rich cultural scene, thriving businesses, and diverse neighborhoods. But in October of 2017, one Atlanta apartment became the setting for a crime so shocking, so incomprehensible, that it stunned even hardened law enforcement officials and prosecutors. The case of Lamora Williams and the deaths of her two young sons represents one of the most disturbing entries in Georgia's criminal history. Lamora Williams was a mother living in Atlanta with her four young sons. Financial struggles and personal challenges characterized her situation, as they do for many single mothers trying to raise multiple children in an expensive city. But the difficulties of her circumstances, while they may have created stress, do not explain or excuse what prosecutors allege she did to two of her children. On October 13, 2017, emergency responders received a report of two unresponsive children at an apartment in Atlanta. When they arrived, they found a scene that shocked them. 1-year-old Jacarter Penn and 2-year-old Kuyant Penn were deceased. But the circumstances of their deaths were unlike anything investigators had encountered before. The initial reports indicated that the children had been found in or near an oven. As the investigation progressed, a horrifying theory emerged. Prosecutors alleged that Lamora Williams had placed her two young sons in the oven, where they died from the heat and their injuries. The image of a mother putting her babies in an oven is so disturbing, so contrary to every instinct of maternal protection, that it defies comprehension. The investigation into the deaths was extensive and complex. Medical examiners had to determine the cause of death and whether it was consistent with the theory of the children being placed in an oven. Investigators had to examine the crime scene carefully, documenting every detail that might shed light on what had occurred. They had to interview witnesses, including potentially the surviving children who had been in the apartment, and piece together a timeline of events. The evidence that emerged supported the prosecution's theory. The children's injuries and condition at the time of death were consistent with extreme heat exposure. The oven in the apartment showed evidence of having been used in a manner consistent with the alleged crime. And investigators found no credible alternative explanation for how the children could have died in this manner. Lamora Williams was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder in the deaths of Jacarter and Kuyant. Additional charges included child cruelty related to the surviving children who had been in the apartment. The charges reflected the severity of the alleged crime and the need to hold Williams accountable if she was indeed responsible for these deaths. The case proceeded through the Fulton County court system. The legal proceedings were closely watched by media outlets and the public, who struggled to understand how a mother could commit such an act. Defense attorneys faced the challenge of defending a client accused of one of the most shocking crimes in recent memory. The defense strategy in a case like this is extremely difficult. When children die in circumstances that appear to involve intentional harm by a parent, and when the evidence supports that theory, there are limited options available. Attorneys might argue that the deaths were accidental, that the mother lacked the mental capacity to form the intent necessary for murder, or that mitigating circumstances should be considered. But these arguments face steep uphill battles when 2 young children are dead in horrific circumstances. The prosecution's case relied on the physical evidence, medical testimony about the cause of death, and the absence of any reasonable alternative explanation. They argued that Lamora Williams had deliberately killed her 2 youngest sons by placing them in the oven. The motive for such an act remained unclear. Was it frustration with the children, mental illness, or something else? But from a legal standpoint, motive is not required for a murder conviction. What matters is whether the defendant committed the act with the required mental state. Expert witnesses played a crucial role in the case. Medical examiners testified about the children's injuries and how they were consistent with exposure to extreme heat. Forensic specialists examined the oven and the apartment for physical evidence. Mental health experts may have been called to testify about Williams's state of mind at the time of the deaths, as this could be relevant both to guilt and to sentencing. The testimony of surviving witnesses, possibly including the other children who had been in the apartment, would have been handled with extreme care. Interviewing child witnesses in cases involving the death of siblings is traumatic and requires specialized techniques to minimize harm to the children while still obtaining necessary information. The children had already suffered the trauma of losing their brothers. Being part of the investigation and prosecution compounded that trauma. Lamora Williams was ultimately convicted of murder charges related to the deaths of Jacarter and Kuyant. The conviction came after presentation of evidence that convinced the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that Williams had killed her sons in the manner alleged. The verdict meant that she would face substantial prison time, potentially spending the rest of her life behind bars. At sentencing, the judge had to consider the nature of the crime, the vulnerability of the victims, and any mitigating factors that might warrant leniency. But in a case involving the intentional killing of 2 babies in such a horrific manner, mitigating factors are difficult to find. Williams was sentenced to a lengthy prison term in a Fulton County proceeding. The impact of this case extended far beyond the courtroom. The Atlanta community was traumatized by the details of what had happened. Parents hugged their children tighter, struggling to comprehend how anyone could harm babies in such a way. Media coverage of the case was extensive, and the story spread beyond Atlanta to national outlets that reported on the shocking crime. The 2 surviving sons in Lamora Williams's custody had to be placed in alternative care. They had lost their brothers, witnessed the aftermath of their deaths, and had their mother arrested and incarcerated. The trauma they experienced will require extensive therapeutic intervention and a stable, nurturing environment to help them heal and develop as normally as possible under the circumstances. Questions arose about whether there had been warning signs that Williams was a danger to her children. Had Child Protective Services been involved with the family? Were there previous reports of abuse or neglect? Could anything have been done to prevent this tragedy? These questions are important for systemic improvement, even though in this case they come too late for Jacarter and Keont. The case also prompted discussions about mental health and motherhood. While mental illness is never an excuse for harming children, it is true that some mothers suffer from severe mental health conditions that affect their ability to safely care for children. Postpartum depression, postpartum psychosis, and other conditions can create risks for both mothers and children. Identifying mothers at risk and providing appropriate intervention and support is crucial for prevention. But attributing crimes like Williams's to mental illness is complicated. Not all mothers who kill their children are mentally ill in a legal or medical sense. Some cases involve mothers who are frustrated, overwhelmed, angry, or impulsive, but who do not meet diagnostic criteria for serious mental illness. And even when mental illness is present, it does not automatically absolve someone of criminal responsibility. Lamora Williams's conviction stands as one of the most disturbing cases in this examination of Georgia's most evil mothers. The method alleged, placing babies in an oven, is so shocking that it seems almost medieval in its cruelty. Yet this happened not in ancient times, but in modern Atlanta, in 2017, to 2 innocent babies who should have been safe in their mother's care. The case serves as a painful reminder that child abuse can take forms so extreme that they challenge our ability to comprehend them. As a society, we want to believe that mothers are naturally protective of their children, that maternal instinct ensures children's safety. Cases like Williams's force us to confront the reality that not all mothers feel or act on that protective instinct, and that some mothers are capable of harming their children in the most horrific ways imaginable. For the Atlanta community, and for everyone who followed this case, the memory of Jacarter and Keont Penn serves as a call to action. We must remain vigilant for signs of child abuse. We must support struggling parents before frustration or mental illness leads to tragedy. We must adequately fund child protective services so they can identify and intervene in dangerous situations. And we must hold accountable those who harm children, ensuring justice for the victims and deterrence for potential perpetrators. Lamora Williams will spend many years, if not the rest of her life, in a Georgia prison. But for Jacarter and Keont, justice came too late. They will never grow up, never experience childhood joys, never have the chance to heal from whatever prompted their mother's horrific actions. Their story is a tragedy that should never have occurred, and their memory demands that we do better at protecting vulnerable children. Case 10. Heather Keaton, the Cherokee County neglect death. Cherokee County, located in the northwestern suburbs of Metro Atlanta, is known for its family-friendly communities, good schools, and suburban lifestyle. It is the kind of place where families move seeking safety, opportunity, and a good environment to raise children. But in 2016, Cherokee County became the setting for a child neglect case so severe that it resulted in criminal charges and the death of a young boy. Heather Keaton was the mother of a 4-year-old boy named Bryce Buchanan. In the normal course of events, Bryce should have been attending preschool or preparing for kindergarten. He should have been playing, learning, growing, and thriving under his mother's care. Instead, he was slowly starving to death in a home in Canton, Georgia. The case came to light in 2016 when authorities were called regarding Bryce's condition. What they found was shocking. A 4-year-old child who weighed only 27 pounds, far below what would be considered healthy for a child his age. Bryce was emaciated, showing clear signs of severe malnutrition and prolonged neglect. He was so malnourished that his life was in immediate danger. Medical professionals who examined Bryce determined that his condition was the result of severe and prolonged neglect. A healthy 4-year-old boy typically weighs between 35 and 45 pounds. At 27 pounds, Bryce was catastrophically underweight. His body had been deprived of adequate nutrition for so long that his growth and development were severely impaired. The malnutrition had affected his organs, his bones, his brain development, and every system in his body. The critical question investigators had to answer was whether this malnutrition was the result of a medical condition or willful neglect. Medical conditions like failure to thrive, absorption disorders, or metabolic problems can cause children to be underweight despite adequate feeding. But medical examination of Bryce suggested that his condition was not the result of disease, but rather of insufficient food intake over an extended period. Investigators examined the home environment where Bryce had been living with his mother. They looked for evidence of whether food had been available in the home and whether Bryce had been given access to it. They interviewed witnesses who had seen Bryce and could speak to his condition over time. They reviewed any medical records to determine whether Heather Keaton had sought appropriate medical care for her son. What emerged was a picture of severe neglect. Bryce had not been adequately fed. His mother had failed to provide him with the basic nutrition necessary for survival. Whether this neglect stemmed from inability, unwillingness, or deliberate cruelty, the result was the same. A 4-year-old child who was literally starving to death under his mother's care. Despite medical intervention, once Bryce's condition came to light, the damage was too severe. His body had been compromised for too long. Bryce Buchanan died as a result of the malnutrition and neglect he had suffered. A 4-year-old child who should have had his whole life ahead of him was dead because his mother had failed in the most fundamental parental duty, to feed her child. Heather Keaton was arrested and charged with serious offenses, including felony murder. In Georgia law, felony murder occurs when someone dies as a result of the commission of certain felonies, even if the death was not intended. In Keaton's case, the underlying felony was child cruelty, her severe neglect of Bryce. Because that neglect resulted in his death, she could be charged with felony murder even if prosecutors could not prove she intended to kill him. The felony murder charge was particularly appropriate in this case because it addressed the reality that Heather Keaton may not have woken up one day and decided to kill her son, but her actions, or more accurately, her inactions, over an extended period resulted in his death, just as surely as if she had used a weapon. Starvation is a slow death, and Bryce suffered for weeks or months as his body wasted away. The case proceeded through the Cherokee County court system. Prosecutors presented medical evidence about Bryce's condition at the time of death and the cause of death. They showed that his weight was incompatible with adequate nutrition. They demonstrated that his mother had been responsible for his care and had failed to provide it. They argued that this failure constituted child cruelty and had resulted in Bryce's death. The defense in such a case faces significant challenges. The evidence of the child's emaciated condition is stark and visual. Medical testimony is clear about the cause of death. The question becomes whether there are any mitigating circumstances that might reduce the defendant's culpability. Was Heather Keaton suffering from mental illness? Did she lack the resources to feed her child? Was she overwhelmed and unable to cope? Did she not understand her child's needs? These questions, while potentially relevant to sentencing, rarely provide complete defenses to the charges. A parent's duty to feed a child is so fundamental that failure to do so, regardless of circumstances, typically results in criminal liability. Society cannot tolerate children starving to death while in their parents' care, even if those parents are struggling with their own issues. The prosecution likely argued that Heather Keaton had options available to her if she truly could not care for Bryce. She could have sought help from family members. She could have reached out to social services. She could have taken Bryce to a hospital or doctor who would have recognized his condition and intervened. The fact that she did none of these things suggested that the neglect was willful rather than the result of circumstances beyond her control. Heather Keaton was convicted of felony murder and related charges. The conviction acknowledged that her neglect had directly caused Bryce's death and that she bore criminal responsibility for that death. The jury's verdict reflected their conclusion that no reasonable parent could have failed to recognize that a 4-year-old child weighing 27 pounds needed immediate help. At sentencing, the judge considered the nature of the crime and the particularly vulnerable victim. Bryce had been completely dependent on his mother for survival. He had no ability to feed himself or seek help. He suffered a prolonged and agonizing death as his body slowly shut down from lack of nutrition. The sentence imposed on Heather Keaton reflected the seriousness of her crime and ensured she would spend substantial time in prison. The case raised difficult questions about how such severe neglect could occur without intervention. Was Bryce enrolled in preschool or daycare where teachers might have noticed his condition? Did he have regular doctor visits where medical professionals would have seen his weight loss? Were there family members who saw him and might have reported concerns? Did neighbors or others in the community notice anything amiss? The answers to these questions are important for understanding how to prevent similar tragedies. Children like Bryce often become invisible, isolated in homes, not enrolled in school or activities, rarely seen by people outside the immediate family. This isolation allows abuse and neglect to continue unchecked. Creating connections for at-risk children through school enrollment, regular medical care, family involvement, and community engagement can provide opportunities for intervention before neglect becomes fatal. The Cherokee County community was shaken by Bryce's death. Many people struggled to understand how a child could starve to death in suburban Atlanta in the 21st century. While we often hear about starvation in impoverished countries or during famines, it seems incomprehensible that it could happen to a child in a relatively affluent American suburb. But child starvation does occur in the United States, usually as a result of severe neglect or deliberate punishment. Some children are denied food as a form of discipline. Others are simply not fed because their caretakers are unable or unwilling to provide for them. And in some tragic cases, children die from this deprivation, just as Bryce did. For the broader community, Bryce's case serves as a reminder that we all have a responsibility to look out for children's welfare. If you see a child who appears malnourished, who seems to lack basic care, or whose caretakers seem unable to provide adequate supervision and support, please reach out to authorities. A phone call to Child Protective Services could save a life. Bryce Buchanan might still be alive if someone had made that call in time. Heather Keaton's conviction concludes our examination of 10 cases of Georgia's most evil mothers. Her crime, while perhaps less sensational than some of the others we have discussed, is no less serious. She allowed her 4-year-old son to starve to death over an extended period while she presumably fed herself. The betrayal of Bryce's trust and dependence represents a fundamental failure of motherhood. As we reflect on all 10 cases presented in this documentary, several common themes emerge. Many of these mothers were dealing with difficult circumstances, financial struggles, relationship problems, substance abuse, or other stressors. But millions of parents face similar challenges without harming their children. The difference is in how these women chose to respond to their circumstances. Some of these cases involved deliberate cruelty, systematic abuse, starvation, or violence directed at helpless children. Others involved neglect so severe that it became criminal. Some occurred in the context of substance abuse or trafficking. But all involved mothers who failed in their fundamental duty to protect and nurture the children in their care. Conclusion: lessons from darkness. As we conclude this deeply disturbing journey through 10 cases of Georgia's most evil mothers, we are left with difficult questions and important lessons. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about parenthood, and about the vulnerability of children in our society. The first and most obvious lesson is that maternal instinct, while powerful for most women, is not universal. We want to believe that all mothers naturally love and protect their children, but these cases demonstrate that some women lack that protective instinct or actively work against it. Evil can exist even in the people who should be most dedicated to protecting innocence. The second lesson is about the importance of vigilance. Many of these children showed signs of abuse or neglect that might have been noticed by alert teachers, neighbors, doctors, or family members. In some cases, Child Protective Services had been involved, but interventions proved insufficient. We must all be willing to report suspicions of child abuse, even when doing so feels uncomfortable or intrusive. The temporary discomfort of reporting a concern is nothing compared to the tragedy of failing to report and later discovering a child has been seriously harmed or killed. The third lesson is about the need for robust child protection systems. Georgia, like all states, has child protective services designed to investigate abuse allegations and protect vulnerable children. But these systems are often underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. Caseworkers carry impossible caseloads that make thorough investigation and ongoing monitoring difficult. We as a society must decide whether we are willing to invest the resources necessary to truly protect children at risk. The fourth lesson relates to the justice system's response to crimes against children. All 10 of these mothers were convicted and received substantial sentences. Georgia's courts have shown that they take crimes against children seriously and are willing to impose severe punishments, including the death penalty in the most aggravated cases. This commitment to justice is important both for accountability and for deterrence. The fifth lesson is about the long-term impact of child abuse. Every one of these cases involved children who died, but many also involved surviving siblings who witnessed the abuse, who were themselves abused, or who lost brothers and sisters. These surviving children will carry the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. They will need extensive therapeutic support, stable and loving homes, and patience from everyone around them as they work to heal. The ripple effects of these crimes extend far beyond the immediate victims. The sixth lesson is about the complexity of prevention. There is no simple formula for identifying which parents might harm their children. Some of these mothers had no prior criminal history. Others had been involved with child services, but had not been deemed serious enough risks to warrant removal of children. Some were dealing with substance abuse or mental health issues, while others showed no obvious signs of impairment. Prevention requires multiple strategies, supporting families in crisis, identifying and treating mental illness and addiction, training professionals to recognize warning signs, and creating communities where children are known and watched over by many adults. The state of Georgia has learned from these cases and continues to refine its child protection policies. Mandatory reporting laws require certain professionals to report suspected abuse. Child Protective Services protocols have been updated based on lessons learned from failures. Law enforcement agencies have developed specialized units for investigating crimes against children. Courts have established specialized calendars for dependency and criminal cases involving child victims. But there is always more work to be done. Each of these 10 cases represents not just a criminal conviction, but a child who died, a family forever altered, and a community traumatized. If we are to prevent future tragedies, we must remain committed to protecting children, supporting families, and holding accountable those who harm the most vulnerable among us. For viewers of this documentary, the cases we have examined are disturbing but important. True crime content serves a purpose beyond entertainment. It educates the public about real dangers, it honors victims by telling their stories, and it can motivate people to be more vigilant in protecting children in their own communities. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, please take action. Contact your local Child Protective Services agency or law enforcement. In Georgia, the Division of Family and Children Services operates a child abuse hotline available 24 hours a day. Nationally, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline provides support and resources. Your report could save a life. Remember the names we have discussed today: Imani Moss, Quentin Simon, Amari Hall, Ja Carter and Kuyant Penn, Bryce Buchanan, and all the other children who suffered at the hands of their mothers. Remember them not just as victims or statistics, but as individual children who deserved better, who should still be alive, who had potential that will never be realized. Remember, too, the mothers whose names have become synonymous with evil: Tiffany Moss, Leilani Simon, Christy Seipel, Rebecca Kipp, Jennifer Cooper, April Short, Jennifer Rosenbaum, Brittany Hall, Lamora Williams, and Heather Keaton. Their actions represent the darkest possibilities of human behavior and the most profound betrayal of trust. They serve as reminders that evil can hide behind familiar faces and that vigilance is always necessary to protect the innocent. As we close this examination of Georgia's most evil mothers, we hope that you, our viewers, will take away not just the horror of these stories, but also a commitment to child protection in your own lives. Be aware, be vigilant, be willing to report concerns, support organizations that protect children, and if you are a parent yourself, let these cases reinforce your commitment to cherishing and protecting the precious lives entrusted to your care. Thank you for watching Cold Case Hour. If you found this documentary valuable, please hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth examinations of true crime cases. Your engagement helps us continue bringing important stories to light. And remember, by being informed and vigilant, we can all play a role in protecting children and preventing tragedies like those we have examined today. The children we discussed today cannot speak for themselves anymore. It falls to us to be their voice, to remember their stories, and to work toward a world where no child suffers the fate they did. May their memories be a blessing and a call to action.